What's going on, online geographers? It's Mr. Majewski, and I am here to introduce you to the topic of the geography of migration. Now, migration is the second chapter in this unit. It's a population migration combo. We've covered population the last couple of weeks. We're moving over to migration this week and next week, and we should test by the end of next week as well. So I'm going to get right into it because this is a lengthy PowerPoint. Migration is a really important topic. It's a topic that many of us are familiar with, right, in our everyday lives. Either we are migrants or we know migrants, or we can trace that back within our own family as well. Let's get right into the nitty-gritty, right into the details, please. All right, let's go to the full screen here. All right, we're going to start with a lot of vocab here. Mobility. So mobility is really just a general term, and it just refers to all types of movement. So migration is a type of mobility, but it's not the only type. Mobility could include everything from your everyday travels, your day-to-day movement from work or school, your weekly visits to your shops, your trips to visit relatives or to visit friends on a regular basis. It could include migration from one country to another, any general movement that occurs. It's a general term that refers to all types of movement. That is what mobility is. Now, when you engage in repetitive acts of mobility, that's circulation. We all have paths of circulation in our lives. A really good example for you is probably the path that you take to and from school every single day. I'm going to suspect you take a pretty similar route, or maybe even the same route every day. And so that's definitely a path of circulation. Perhaps trips to the store, all right, or to friends' places, or maybe to church, right, or the movie theater, right, or athletic fields if you're in a sport. Right? All of those are examples of path of circulation. So again, mobility is movement, circulation is repetitive movement, and that's going to eventually take us to migration. Now, I don't know why, but I love this image, right? Here's a girl clearly very excited about her Bed Bath Beyond and her moving in at college. So this would be a good example of mobility. We have kids that are moving in, right? So moving from home to college, and also circulation, because we can predict that most of these kids are probably going to head back at the end of the school year for the summer, so they're going to go back and forth between school and home. Now, we take it for granted, but billions of people in this world really don't have access to the mobility that they would like. There are walls that separate. There are physical barriers like oceans or mountains, right? Or there maybe are cultural, social, or legal barriers that get in the way. Okay, so let's get to it. What is migration? Migration is a permanent move to a new location. So when you move permanently or semi-permanently, or your intention is to move permanently, then that means you are engaged in migration. Now, every time you migrate, you are leaving one place and you are going to a new one. Where you left, that is called emigration. So emigration with an E and only one M is migration from a location. Immigration with an I and two M's is migration to a location. So, for instance, when Mr. Majewski's great-grandparents came to the United States, they emigrated from Poland. They immigrated to the United States, and specifically into the New York area at first. All right? So migration, a permanent move, and emigration from immigration to that location. So when you migrate, you are both an emigrant and an immigrant at the same time. Now, net migration is the difference between those two things. Net migration is how many people do you have coming into your country every year? How many people do you have leaving, right? And that determines your net migration. If you have more people coming in than leaving, you're going to have a positive net migration, right? If you have more people leaving, so you have more immigrants than you do immigrants arriving, then you're going to have a negative net migration, reflecting the fact that you are losing more people than you are gaining every single year. All right? So again, a place has either net in migration or net out. Net in means they're bringing in more people than they're losing. All right? Net out means they're losing more than they are bringing in. Now, let's do an example here. Fictitious country, we'll call it Majewskia. We've got 250,000 migrants coming into the country every year, so 250,000 emigrants, and 700,000 immigrants leaving. Altogether, if we add that up to determine the net migration, we would subtract the number coming in, the number leaving from the number coming in. My math sucks. That should be negative 450,000 people. So as a result, since this is a negative, since they're losing more than they're coming in, it is net out migration. Now, please fix that number. It should read 450 minus 450,000, not minus 550,000. Mr. Majewski gets an F in basic addition and subtraction. Again, in this case, that is a net out country. Now, I'm going to make it really simple for you. Generally speaking, highly developed countries or developed countries, core countries, wealthier countries tend to be net in. And developing countries, stages 2, stages 3, tend to be net out. So stage 4, stage 5 countries on the demographic transition, those are usually almost always net in. And stage 2 and stage 3 are almost always net out. So the more developing you are, the more net out you are. The more developed, the more you are a magnet that attracts workers and migrants from around the world, the more net in you are. Now, this slide basically reiterates what I just said. The global patterns reflect migration patterns, flows, move from the developing world, developing regions and developing countries towards developed ones. All right, so not surprisingly, net out regions, Asia is a huge net out region. A lot of developing countries there, huge populations, and so as a result, a lot of folks are willing to migrate to somewhere else where they see greater opportunity for themselves. Latin America is also net out. They lose more than they attract, than they bring in on a yearly basis. And Africa is net out as well. They lose more than they bring in. Now, what are net in? Well, the core regions, the most developed regions of the world are. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that's been paying attention so far. North America, net in. And most of their migration comes from Latin America and Asia. Europe, net in. Most of theirs comes from Asia and Africa. Oceania, net in. Again, most of their migrants come from Africa and especially Asia. So again, you can really divide the world up into the developed versus the developing, and you can really predict a lot about migration that's happening there. This is a wonderful map. Really quickly, what kind of map is that again? I'll wait a couple seconds. Yes, that's right. It's a flow line map. Or, gosh, you were wrong. It's a flow line map. This is a map that shows worldwide migration flows in the early 2000s. So the wider the arrow, the larger the arrow, the more people moved from that area to where the arrow ends up. So let's look at North America, for instance, here. North America clearly has a large number of migrants from Asia. They also have a large number that come from Latin America as well. Together, those are the two largest sources of migration in the United States. All right, let's look at Europe. Europe has a large number of migrants from Africa, right? So that seems to be their greatest area of international migration. They also have migration flows that stream from South America, Latin America, and Africa as well. All right, look at Oceania. Oceania gets a lot of their immigration, right, from Southeast Asia, which makes sense. Distance decay, they're right next to one another. Do you notice how that's the case with all of these countries and regions? Latin America, where do they end up? North America. Distance decay, right, the shortest distance. Africa, Europe, right? Southeast Asia, Oceania. That's not a shock. That's not a mistake. People tend to go shorter distances, and they go to the most developed area that's accessible to them. All right. Meanwhile, take a look at Africa. You'll notice no arrows pointing in, right? All of them are pointing out, which again is a general sign to us that Africa is more net out than net in. All right. Well, that's going to take us right there to our first. In the 1800s, a really famous geographer named Ernst Ravenstein, E.G. Ravenstein was actually his abbreviated name. He wrote a series of what he called rules or laws that he said kind of predicted the behavior of most migrants. Now, we look at these laws throughout the unit, and we're going to look at our first one now. And what we need to ask ourselves is, hey, Ravenstein came up with these in the 1800s, so literally like 130, 140 years ago. Are they still accurate today? And if so, how accurate? And if not, which ones are less accurate than they once were? And what we find is while Ravenstein's laws are not as accurate as they once were, they're more accurate than you might think. They're still generally true even today, 130, 140 years later. So Ravenstein's first law of migration actually has two parts to it. The first says, hey, most migrants relocate a short distance. And most migrants stay within the same country when they migrate. So right there, I think in our minds when we think of migration, we think of like these international journeys from one side of the world to the other. But what we find is most migration that occurs actually goes a very short distance. People tend to migrate to the shortest available location to them. And overwhelmingly, most migration that occurs within the same country. Now, hey, stop and think about this. How many times have you moved in your life? And then how many of those moves were from one country to another? I think the answer is most of the time, most of our moves were within the same country. And so, I think most of us would agree that when people move, they generally move shorter distances unless there's a really strong reason to move further away. So together, those two laws absolutely are still true today. Secondly, Ravenstein said that when migrants do go longer distances, and it is international, so they head to other countries, when they do, they almost always go to the largest, most populous centers of economic activity. So they go to big cities. So again, if we're summarizing Ravenstein's first law of migration, most migrants move short distances, most migrants stay within the same country, but when they travel longer distances and leave the country, they tend to move to large population and economic centers, big cities, because there's more available jobs, there's more people to blend in, there's more folks that probably came from where they came, so the transition to this new place will be made a little bit easier. All right? Remember these laws. Now, let's get into categories of migration. Well, first, it just referenced it in the first Ravenstein law, but let's get into it in more detail. There are two general categories of migration. The first is international, and that means when you move from one country to another. All right, so anytime you start in one country and you permanently move to another, that is international migration. And that can be one of two categories. It can be voluntary, and that's, of course, when someone volunteers to move, to leave. They choose to leave of their own accord. They're not pressured to. They feel like now is the right time for them. All right, so they're making the choice for themselves. Somebody else is not. The opposite of that, of course, is forced migration. That is when you are, in fact, compelled to move. You are forced to move against your wishes or against your will. Oftentimes, this is by a higher power. So maybe the government is forcing you to move, or armed or militant groups in your area where you're fearing for your safety. All right. Most voluntary migration is driven by better economic conditions. Look, if you get a question that asks why do most migrants migrate, the answer is almost always first choice should be economics, jobs, better jobs, better wages, right? More job security, better economic state there, right? So better economic conditions, right? That would include things like housing, all right? Any economic reason. Oh, I wanted a better life. What do you mean? I wanted more money, right? I wanted a better life for my kids. That's economic, and that is always the number one reason why migrants choose to voluntarily leave. And again, I think if you asked yourself or your friends, hey, why did you migrate to Anaheim? Why did you end up here? Why did you and your families choose to settle here? Most of the time, the answer would be better economic conditions. I know it was with my family. Better economic conditions in the United States and Poland. And then in Chicago specifically, they relocated because Chicago was booming and had a lot of industrial jobs. All right. Now, when we're talking about forced migration, usually the causes of that are not economic. They are usually something that is threatening the safety or literally the home itself where someone lives. So, for instance, war is one of the biggest causes of forced migration, especially civil war, when groups within a country wage war against one another for control, and oftentimes the citizens are caught in between. Oppression is another major cause of forced migration. And again, oppression is when a government oppresses or takes advantage of, exploits, abuses, violates the rights of its own citizens. So, for instance, if a religious group or a racial or ethnic group were being targeted by the government for political reasons, that would be oppression, and that is oftentimes a reason for forced migration. Forced is not where somebody says, oh my God, the situation sucks here, I gotta leave. Forced is when literally government people come to your house and take it from you, or armed militias show up at your front door and say, if you do not leave right now or in the next couple of days, we will kill you. So there's a very major difference. The other cause of forced migration, natural disasters. All right. Oftentimes, natural disasters can occur in a developing country, and the developing country's neighborhoods and citizens are unable to rebuild. And so their homes may physically be destroyed, or even their neighborhoods or entire cities. Think about the damage an earthquake can do in a developing world. Think about the damage that a tsunami or flooding, even drought can cause with climate change occurring that can completely result in an environmental, natural force that causes a person to leave. All right, and here's a good example. People in La Paz, Bolivia, landslide, lose their homes, right? This is what's left of those homes. And so temporary shelters have been built for them as they are forced from their homes. Another good example is, again, war, conflict. Syria is a great example. Syria has been engaged in a really brutal civil war for close to a decade now. And more than half of the country's population no longer lives in their houses. They have been forced to migrate either to other parts of the country or to other places around the world. Now, if international migration was our first category, internal is our second. Internal is when you stay within the same country. You make a move within the same country. So international from one country to another, internal, inside means you stay within the same country. So if Mr. M moves from Florida to California, or I move from Texas to New York, or I move from one place in Anaheim to another place in Anaheim, I am engaged in internal migration because I have not left the country I started in, the U.S. Now, there are two subcategories of internal migration. First, interregional. Interregional means movement between regions of a country. So if Mr. Majewski got a job on the East Coast of the United States and I relocated from California, the West Coast, the Pacific Coast to the Atlantic Coast, that's a move from one region of our country to another. And that would be a interregional migration. Let's say Mr. Majewski, decides that he wants to move in with somebody that I meet online, alrighty, and I decide to move to, Alaska. Well, that's a totally different climate region than California, and so again, that would be an example of interregional migration. I haven't left the country, I've just moved from one region to another, all right? Intra-regional is when you stay within the same region. So if I move from one house in Anaheim to another, yes, I've moved. Yes, it's internal. But I have not left the region. I'm still in California. I'm still in Southern California, right? So that would definitely not fit. All right? Some historic examples of interregional migration. Well, when a country industrializes, farmers move from the farming areas to the urban city areas in a country. That's interregional migration, and they do that because there's not as many farmers needed because machines are doing the work, and so those farmers that lose their jobs move to cities to take on factory jobs as that country industrializes. Intra-regional, well, let me give you a good example. Let's say Mr. Majewski has lived in Anaheim for many years, and I live in an older home, and I would like to move out to one of the newer houses, kind of towards Anaheim Hills. I'm staying in Anaheim. I'm staying within the region, right? But I would like to move to that suburb home, to that newer home, that quieter home, that larger home. And so as a result, I'm engaged in intra-regional migration. So again, International is either forced or voluntary. Internal is either interregional or intra. Mexico is a really great example of all of these factors. First, international migration. Well, they have net in migration coming from Central America, from Guatemala, Honduras, and places like Nicaragua. They also have net out migration, as they have peeps that are migrating to the United States. So two different examples of international migration. One bringing folks in, one having folks leave. Internally, all right, we also have examples. We have people in the central Mexican states, like Zacatecas, who are relocating to border regions, border states like Sonora and Chihuahua. And there's a lot of question as to why that's taking place. Well, one, a lot of folks are relocating to border states so they can move internationally later on. The other reason is a lot of American businesses have set up factories in these border states. They do so because of distance decay, so it's easier for them to send their products back to the U.S. to be sold. So they make their products here, where workers tend to work for lower wages, and then they ship them across to the United States. And as a result, they need workers in these factories. And many Mexican citizens are willing to move to these states to take on these factory jobs. These factories are called maquiladoras. And as a result of them taking those jobs, we see an internal movement of people interregionally from other regions of the country to the border. All right. We also have intra-regional. We have the city-states immediately around Mexico City having folks move into the urban areas of Mexico City. So they're in the same state, right, or state surrounding the city, and they are relocating into it, which means, again, internal migration, only in this instance, intra-regional. Hey, speaking of migration and the migration and stages of it, I've asked what sort of migration is going to be happening as a country develops. Well, there's actually a model for this as well. And you are going to be plugging in details for each of these stages into the DTM chart that you've been working on the last couple of weeks, I should say. And it's going to obviously fit into the category labeled migration. So just like a country has population changes that occur as it progresses, just like a country has epidemiological changes as it develops, a country has changes to migration as it goes through the DTM as well. Now, stage one country. Remember, a stage one country is totally unindustrialized, all right? So these are not folks that really are able to travel long distances. Instead, these aren't folks that even have agriculture or industry at all. They hunt and gather for their food. And so the type of migration we see in stage one would be internal only, right? Because they don't even have the ability to leave and go to other places. They don't have the means to do so. And what they're doing is they're spending their entire days moving around, finding animals to hunt, finding nuts and berries that they can forage. And they move seasonally, right? In cold months, they're obviously not going to find as many plants and things like that, right? So they're going to need to probably try to hunt more. In warmer months, they can rely more, obviously, on plants, fruits, vegetables for sustenance. So stage one, no international migration, in or out. It's all internal, and it's just daily, seasonal search for food, tribes moving around, small bands, small groups, just trying to find their next meal. Now, things start to get interesting in stage two. In stage two, a country begins to industrialize, and we already know the death rate comes down. So now there's a feeling that this is a country whose population is exploding. It's getting very large, very quick. And so as a result, a stage two country is going to see two different types of immigration happening. First, they will have out-migration to developed places. So people are going to leave this stage two country. Internationally, they are going to try to travel to more developed places. All right? At the same time that international emigration is occurring in this stage two country, there's also going to be interregional migration. So there'll be some internal at the same time, and specifically it'll be interregional. And the movement will be from the rural agricultural areas to the urban city. And I've kind of already talked about why. As a country starts to industrialize, You need far fewer farmers than you did before. And so those farmers who lose their farms, who lose their jobs, are going to relocate to cities to take on these new industrial factory jobs that have become available. Stage 3, now as a country continues to develop and move into stage 3. They continue to have high international immigration, and especially you're going to start to see in-migration as well. So you're not going to see as much out-migration in 3 as you did in 2. It's going to start to reduce because this country is becoming slowly a better place, right? And you're actually going to start to see some in-migration by people who live in stage 2 places, right? Stage 2 countries that would like to come to your stage 3 country because they see it as a better chance for success. So again, high international immigration, but not as much out migration, and starting to see some in-migration. At the same time, internally, we're continuing to see interregional migration taking place. This is happening as people relocate from cities to the suburbs, to the new neighborhoods outside of the main city area. So cities grow, right? More people move in, the city starts to expand outward. Where do most of the new homes and businesses and most of the best residences end up being? They tend to be towards the outsides of the city. So in stage 3, you've got high international immigration, both in and a diminishing amount of out. And then you have interregional migration as you continue to see people move to the cities from rural areas. At the same time, you start to see intra-regional as people begin to relocate to suburbs, the new neighborhoods towards the outer edges. Stage 4, it's really the same as stage 3. But we're starting to see people begin to choose to relocate back into cities as well, because cities are viewed as hip and happening in many places. All right, so again, countries go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. There really isn't a stage 5 of the migration transition yet. Maybe we will see it later on. But again, stage 1, seasonal internal migration. Stage 2, international out, and internal, interregional from rural areas to cities as you industrialize. Stage 3, less net out migration and the beginnings of net in. At the same time, we still have folks moving from rural areas to cities, but we're starting to see intra-regional from the cities themselves into the newer places outside of the city that are called suburbs. Finally, stage 4, really what you're seeing in stage 3 just intensifies. By stage 4, you really no longer have out migration. You are in net in only at this point. And you'll start to see some folks who move to suburbs during stage 3 consider moving back into the downtown areas where the nightlife is, where the happening areas are. Think about hipsters who like to relocate into neighborhoods that are run down and kind of revive them again. All right? So anytime I ask you about the DTM, you also need to know what would be happening in that country on the ETM and on the migration transition model as well. Now, just so you know, 9% of the world's population are international migrants, so they were not born in the country that they currently live. So about 1 out of 10 people worldwide is a foreign-born resident. And ironically enough, despite what you might hear a lot in the news or in the media recently, the U.S. is actually the place that welcomes the most. We have the most foreign-born residents of any country in the world. We have 43 million foreign-born residents that live here. That's a lot more than our next closest net in countries. So the U.S. is a magnet. It attracts people from around the world in huge, huge numbers. Okay, let's get to this. Now, we're on to the eras of immigration in the U.S., and there is a chart that you must fill out that is related to this, and that chart is linked in this folder after the PowerPoint. All right, so really quick, I'm not spending much time on this. The U.S. has experienced immigration throughout our history. Now, in the 16 and the 1700s, Almost all of that immigration came from England, from Great Britain. We were English colonies, and so naturally, 90% of the people that came here in the 17 and early 1800s were English. All right? About 2 million migrated, and again, about 90% of those, right, 1.8 million were British. So everything was pretty much British in this country, or English in this country, until the early 1800s, all right? Once we get into the 1800s and we actually became the United States and we're no longer colonies, things started to change. So up to 1800, we only had 2 million people. But between 1820 and 1920, 32 million people came to the United States, and over 90% of those people came from Europe. So again, our first wave is almost all English, 2 million people. Our second wave is almost all European, but it now jumps to 32 million people. All right, so as you can see, the U.S. was really a magnet, a draw to the rest of the world. Now, first off, I can't spell immigration. Are you kidding me? Where in Europe did these waves of immigrants come from? If they had come from England before, what about in the 1800s? Well, Ireland and Germany. All right, were responsible for most of our immigration throughout most of the 1800s. Then Northern Europeans, right, Scandinavians. But are you noticing that every one of the groups so far that I've referenced are Northern Europeans? So we had a lot of Northern European migrants here at the time. By the way, these are voluntary migrants. Obviously, we had millions of forced migrants in the U.S., African slaves and Native Americans as well. Our final wave of voluntary migration in the 18 and 1900s, in the 1800s and early 1900s, was also from Europe, from Southern and Eastern Europe. All right, so we're starting to see the places in Europe changing. All of these waves were caused by overpopulation in the home countries. Specifically, there were issues in Ireland related to the potato famine, so an environmental disaster. Problems in Germany related to political instability, revolutions that were taking place, also in Scandinavia. And Southern and Eastern Europe as well, there's a feeling that these countries are overpopulated, and the U.S. needed workers. And so many of these folks are willing to come to the United States for work or for farmland as we industrialized. All right? And again, when we're talking about English immigrants up to 1800, about 2 million people, that's it. Right? They don't even register on our chart here. But let's look what happens beginning in 1820. Look at this massive increase in immigration, and specifically, do you notice how much of this chart is red? Is this color? That means they're coming from Europe. Just that little sliver of this big chart came from Canada, and that even smaller sliver came from Asia. Alrighty. So up until 1920 or so, we are a massively growing population. We are a massive magnet for immigrants. And specifically, we are almost entirely European, all right, in our makeup. Now, look what happens here. Beginning in the 1920s, do you see this drop-off that continues all the way until the 1950s and 60s? Well, what happens there is immigration to the U.S. comes to a sudden halt. There's some reasons for that. One, World War I takes place, and the U.S. is dragged into it. We find during times of war, people are less willing to voluntarily migrate. The Great Depression occurs during this era of the 1920s and 30s, and the economy tanked, and so suddenly the U.S. wasn't nearly as desirable as it had been previously. And then, after the Great Depression, World War II hit, and that kept the path to America closed for a lot of immigrants. Wars are going on, so we're not really accepting people into the country. The economy is very bad. In addition to that, the United States passed some really harsh laws in the 1920s that completely cut off immigration to the United States, or at least reduced it to a fraction of what it had been. These were called Quota Laws. And they set a limit on the number of immigrants that could come to the country. And specifically, they set limits on the number of folks that could come from Southern and Eastern Europe. They cut off Asian immigration entirely. So they only really gave preference to Northern Europeans, like the English people, like Germans, and like Irish. So again, it kept our country very English and German in our origins all the way up until the 1960s. And then everything begins to change. In the 1960s, we got rid of those quota laws. We passed a new law called the Immigration Act of 1965, and we said, hey, we're going to accept anybody that wants to come, regardless of where they came from. Now, instead of having quotas that limit the number of people from specific countries, now we just have an overall limit. And we will take whoever is in the front of that line who has filed the first and has been waiting the longest, and who has met all of the other qualifications. So today, and really since the 1960s, we really don't have European immigration anymore. Now, almost all of our immigration is coming from Latin America and Asia, specifically coming from Mexico and Central America, and specifically coming from places like the Philippines and Vietnam and China, all right, and India. All of those are major sources of immigration since the 1960s. Now, how does this reflect what the U.S. looks like today? Well, only a few years ago did Mexico officially become the country with the most immigrants to the U.S. Up until then, it had been Germany. All right. Now, admittedly, a lot of migrants are living here without documentation. So technically, Mexico probably was the biggest source all the way back to the 80s, but we didn't officially know it until we took a census a few years back. Hey, really quickly, I want to show you the change that happens. Look at 1965, and this is the graph in immigration, right? Do you see how immigration starts to go up, and it continues to really go up after that, right? That's because we got rid of those quotas, and we passed the Immigration Act of 1965, and we raised the limit and said we're not going to restrict some countries from coming, all right? Not only do we see a big boost in the numbers, but do you see now that red that used to make up almost all of our migrants? Now it's only responsible for a fraction of it, right? And suddenly, look at purple, look at Asia, look at blue, Latin America, right? Shoot, look at orange, even Africa. Do you see suddenly now they're the sources of our immigration all the way since the 1960s? So before the 1960s, it's Europe, all right? And you do need to know where in Europe they came during those waves. England, prior to this chart being created, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia here, all right? And then Southern and Eastern Europe, so Poland, Russia, Italy, here. And then after 1965, it's Latin America, and it's Asia. All righty? Make sure you know it, my friends. All right, so let's get to this. This is an interesting slide. It shows you the source country for most immigrants by state from the 1800s all the way up till modern times. Now, it goes kind of fast, which kind of sucks, but what I would do is focus on a state, and then over time, take a look at how that state changes in terms of where the immigrants come from, all right? So let's just focus, for instance, on let's just pick a state on the East Coast, all righty? So how about we choose a state like, I don't know. How about, New York. Okay. So New York, beginning in 1850. Irish, German, Russian, Italian, Dominican Republic. Okay, that's a good one. So you're noticing the patterns that we talked about. In the 1800s, it's Ireland and Germany. Then as you get into the 1900s, you start to see Russia and Italy. So we're seeing more Europeans, but no longer Northern Europeans. Now we're seeing the Southern and Eastern ones. Then as you got into the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, Dominican Republic. That means Latin America, right? So we're seeing those changes that are occurring. In the 1800s, it's Northern and Western Europe. In the 1900s, it's Southern and Eastern Europe, and then it becomes Latin America and Asia. Alrighty? Let's take another look now. Why don't we look at, how about Illinois? All right, Illinois is right here, and let's wait for it to start again in 1800 and 1850 and go. Germany, 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 Poland, Germany, Poland, Poland, Mexico, 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 Mexico. Perfect. Northern Europe, 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 Eastern, back to Northern, Eastern, Eastern, Latin America, Latin America, Latin America, Latin America. Awesome. All righty. I think we should even try to take a look at California. Obviously, California is a little different. We would expect to see a lot more Latin America and Asia because of our proximity. So let's take a look here. All right. All right, 1850, Mexico, China, Ireland, China, Germany, Germany, Italy, Mexico, 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 Mexico. Perfect. Okay. So China, right, and Ireland and Germany, actually those fit. China was one of the few places in the 1800s where immigrants came from in order to build railroads and to do mining, and they did cluster in California. Can we look at one more while we're at it? Why don't we just pick a random state as well? And how about we go with, oh, I don't know. Let's go with, well, Michigan. All righty. Let's go Michigan. All right, let's go. Ireland, Germany, Canada, 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 Canada. Wow, Canada, 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 Mexico, Mexico. So again, we're seeing some similar patterns. Canada is basically like Europe. So I'm not tremendously surprised to see there's a lot of Canadians, especially since there's a border right there with Canada. All right. Can we try one more? Let's go Minnesota here. All right. Germany, 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 Sweden, 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 Canada, Canada, Laos, Mexico, Mexico, Mexico. Oh, wow. Okay, so we got a lot going here. Northern Europe, 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 Northern, 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 North America, Asia, Mexico, Latin America. Wow, interesting stuff here. All right. By the end of the map, notice how much this color for Mexico and how much, I believe it's blue for Asia, are displayed. Vietnam, Laos was up there. Remember, Vietnam, China. So you're seeing a lot more Latin America and Asia by the end of this map. All right. Love this as well. It shows by county the largest percentage of ancestries. So they looked at every county and said, hey, where do the largest number of ancestors originate from? It tells you a lot about who immigrated where. So, for instance, these areas predominantly African American. So we can assume these folks came originally from Africa. I wonder if that was forced migration. And these are the legacies of our long history of slavery in this country. All right. If you look in this area, kind of this blue, that's German. All righty. And again, we have a long history of just generations of German immigrants. All right. We even have American Indians here, forced migrants onto reservations in certain places, right? That are reflected there. We have English numbers. We have large Irish numbers. All right. And so again, we're seeing Italian well represented here as well in some places, right? So again, you are really seeing a lot of evidence of migration occurring in this country as time goes by. Finally, this is an awesome chloropleth map, and it shows where migrants today tend to cluster. And what you'll notice is migrants do not evenly distribute. The dark red and pink kind of colored areas are where most migrants end up. And what do you notice? One, they tend to be areas that have large populations and large cities. And they tend to be areas that are the closest in proximity to where the migrants are coming from. So California, big draw. We get Asian immigrants. We also get Latin American immigrants coming up from Mexico. All right, so we get a double whammy here. We have huge cities, huge urban centers like San Francisco and Los Angeles that really attract people to our area. Seattle as well, right? It attracts a lot of Asian immigrants additionally. Now, Texas is another big draw, and almost all of theirs is coming from Latin America, particularly Mexico. Again, proximity-based reasons. Florida is a big magnet. And by the way, going back to Texas, Dallas, Houston, large urban centers. Florida, Miami is here, right? And proximity-wise, it's very close to Cuba. It's close to Puerto Rico. It's close to the Dominican Republic. And so we get huge number of migrants there. Finally, New York and New York City is another migrant-friendly place. And again, a lot of migrants from the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic. Also, a lot of migrants, interestingly enough, from China make their way to New York as well. Basically, the best way I can summarize this map is the green and light green areas tend to be places that have very few large cities, large urban areas. And they are not as easy to access as other states are for immigrants to the United States. All right. That's going to shut it off there, folks. We are going to be moving over to push and pull factors as part of our next folder. Have a great remainder to your day. Make sure you do both of the activities that are related specifically to this lecture. Make sure you're plugging in the info from this lecture onto your slides so that you can do the remainder of the work this week as well.